Hey everyone, welcome back to 1:35 a.m. This time we're reading the second story again, Room for One More. If you didn't see the first part, there's a playlist on my channel with all of these audiobooks that you could find easily and save to your library. So, that's fun. But today we're going to be reading, as I said, the second part out of 3. This story seems to be a bit shorter than some of the other ones. About half as long as the last one, actually. So these parts might be a bit shorter, and that's why. Alright, let's read. He slept for 8 hours, a dark, dreamless sleep. When he woke up, his throat felt like someone had cut it. He clutched his neck and drew his hand away and looked at it, expecting to see blood. He sat up slowly, his head fuzzy, achy, and disoriented. His left arm was still numb and felt heavy and weak, a leaden object that he was forced to drag around but was of not much use to him. He popped another throat lozenge even though the first one hadn't begun to touch his level of pain. In the bathroom, he looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept for days, even though he should have been well rested. A sore throat. What did his mom used to give him for a sore throat when he was a kid? He flashed back to days when he would stay home sick from school, and his mom would take care of him. Hot tea with lemon and honey. That was what she had always made for him. He was pretty sure he had some tea bags somewhere. He went to the kitchen and rummaged through the cabinets until he found a box of tea bags that had been there since who knows when. Tea doesn't expire, does it? He thought. He microwaved a cup of water and submerged the tea bag in it. He found a little plastic packet of honey in the drawer that was full of restaurant takeout packets of mustard, ketchup, and soy sauce. He stirred the honey into the tea. He remembered his mom saying the honey was for soothing because it coated your throat. He didn't remember what the lemon was for, but he would have to do without it. He turned on the TV to check sports scores and sipped his hot drink. It helped a little bit. When he finished, he went back to the kitchen and opened a can of chicken noodle soup. Chicken soup was supposed to be good for sick people, right? He heated the soup on the stove, then took a bowl of it into the living room to eat in front of the TV. He quickly discovered that all he could manage was sipping the broth. The chicken chunks and noodles hurt too much going down. It felt like he was swallowing rocks. Stanley took more ibuprofen and sucked on another throat lozenge and hoped that he would feel better as the evening wore on. But the feeling of pain in his throat didn't go away any more than the feeling of anything in his left arm coming back. He toyed with the idea of calling in sick, but he knew he wouldn't miss out on 8 hours of pay. Money was too tight. He barely had enough for rent and groceries as it is. When he put on his uniform, the left sleeve of his shirt was so tight he could barely bend his elbow. It was not an easy walk to work, with his painful throat and his lifeless left arm, but eventually he made it to the storage yard and down the hidden stairs. As usual, he held his breath passing the stinking bio-waste bin, and scanned his ID badge at the door. In the facility, he let his eyes adjust to the dim greenish light for a moment before heading into the security office. He checked the monitors and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Good. He was tired and in pain and ready for a nap. He leaned up back in his chair and let the warm oblivion of sleep overtake him. He awoke with a gasp, feeling like he was being watched. He looked around and checked the monitors. Nothing. But the doll was at his desk again. He picked it up and smiled at it. "You again?" he said. His voice was getting hoarser. "Where did you come from? Is somebody playing a game with me?" Maybe he had a secret admirer, he thought, but he immediately dismissed the idea as ridiculous. What kind of weirdo secret admirer would leave him a ballerina doll? Not the kind of secret admirer he'd want, for sure. He tilted the doll over to activate her voice. "We like you," she chirped, in her happy little girl tone. "I like you too, little dolly," Stanley said. "Not sure why I do, but I do." Maybe having the talking doll with him there at work was like people who kept the TV in the background all the time in their homes. A little bit of noise was a reminder that even if it didn't feel that way, you weren't all alone in the world. Sad, but understandable. The world was a lonely place. He turned over the doll again. "Take me home with you," she said. "Well, I was going to take you home with me yesterday, but when I woke up you were gone. I guess you missed your chance, huh? Who do you belong to, anyway?" He tilted her. "Take me home with you." He examined the doll. "Maybe you belong to the kid of somebody else who works here. I don't want to take away some kid's toy. You'd be better off with a little girl than with me." "Take me home with you," the doll said again. Too bad real women weren't this insistent on having his company. Some little girl could be really upset if her dolly's gone, and I'm a big grown man, I don't have any use for dollies. So why was he talking to this doll as if he could understand what he said, and making his sore throat sorer in the process? This virus, or whatever it was, must be making him loopy, he thought. And here he went again, tilting the thing to hear what it would say. "Take me home with you." He set the doll down on the desk. It had officially crossed the line from cute to annoying. Okay, if you stay put on this desk until my shift is over, I'll take you home with me. But now it's nap time, nighty-night." He leaned back in his chair and dozed off again. Stanley was running late for work. He was trying to get ready, but his big fat fingers were too clumsy to button the shirt of his uniform or tie his shoes. He needed help, but he was utterly alone. Finally, knowing he would be terribly late if he didn't leave right away, he ran out onto the street in his half-buttoned shirt and untied shoes. But when he looked around, all the familiar landmarks of his neighborhood were gone. Where was Greenblatt's Deli? Where was the Dutch Girl Dry Cleaners? He looked up at a street sign and saw that the street names had changed. The sign that had once said Forest Avenue now said Fazbear Avenue. It made no sense, but he was lost. How could that be when he was just 10 steps from the door of his apartment building? Finally, he hailed a cab and told the driver the address of the storage yard that hid his place of employment. None of the streets or buildings looked familiar as he rode through the city, but the driver seemed to know where he was going. Stanley told himself to breathe and relax. It was okay. Things were under control now. The cab stopped on a dark side street that Stanley didn't recognize. Maybe the cab driver didn't know where he was going after all. "Hey, buddy," Stanley said, "I don't think you got the right address." When the cab driver turned around, his face wasn't human. It was a bizarre robotic version of an animal's face, pink and white with a long snout, large ears, and glowing yellow eyes. The face, apparently hinged, split open, revealing the full orbs of the creature's eyes and a mouthful of knife-like teeth. It opened its jaw wider and lunged towards Stanley in the back seat, shattering the point of glass that separated them. Had he screamed? Stanley wondered as he tried to shake off the nightmare. Probably his sore throat had rendered him so hoarse that he couldn't have screamed if he had tried. But even if he had, who would have heard him, squirreled away in his tiny dark office? He could die in here and nobody would notice. Nobody guards the security guard. What was that thing in his dream, anyway? When he finally woke all the way and could reorient himself to his familiar surroundings, he noticed the doll was once again gone. It was weird. He kind of wanted to tell someone about it, but who could he tell? At the city diner, Katie filled his coffee cup. "You look like you could use this," she said. Stanley winced as he tried to swallow a sip of the scalding liquid. Coffee was probably a bad idea. "You want your usual, or do you want to go the healthy route again?" she asked. "Oatmeal," Stanley said, his voice a scratchy croak. "Just a bowl of oatmeal." Katie knitted her brow. "Are you okay, Stan? You don't sound so good." It was nice that she cared enough to ask. "Sore throat's worse." He rubbed his neck. "Don't think I can eat solid food." "Okay, oatmeal it is. But have you seen a doctor? You know, the drugstore around the corner has a little walk-in clinic. When I had an ear infection last month, they gave me some medicine that fixed me right up. They're pretty inexpensive, too." No doctors. People always thought doctors could fix everything. But when Stanley's dad had gotten so sick he couldn't work anymore, he'd gone to the doctor and taken every medicine and done every torturous treatment he'd been told to. Within 6 months, he was dead anyway. "It's actually a nurse instead of a doctor at the clinic," Katie said. "She's really nice. She'll just ask you some questions, take a look at your ears, nose, and throat, and then write you a prescription." "It's just some kind of bug. It'll run its course," Stanley rasped. He had to admit he did sound terrible, though. "Suit yourself," Katie said. "I'll get you your oatmeal. I'm also going to bring you a large orange juice on the house. A little extra vitamin C can't hurt." "Thank you." Stanley was struck by how caring Katie was. He wondered if she was single. It would be nice to have someone who cared about him. Eating the oatmeal felt like swallowing hot sand. Hoping for relief, he sipped some orange juice, but it burned his throat like battery acid. On his way home, he stopped at the drugstore and bought some throat lozenges that were supposed to be stronger than the ones he had been using. He doubted they would be enough, though. Once he was back in his apartment, he kicked off his shoes and collapsed on his bed without even taking off his uniform. He was asleep in seconds. He woke 7 hours later to a ringing phone. His mouth was dry as dust, and his throat stung and burned. He reached for the phone with his good arm, but quickly discovered that it was numb and swollen too. Awkwardly, he managed to lift the phone and put it to his ear. Hello? His voice was a scratchy whisper. Stan, is that you? It was his older sister, Melissa. Yeah, hi sis. He hadn't seen her since his nephew's birthday party, but usually she called from time to check on him. You sound awful. Stanley could hear the worry in her voice. Are you sick? Come down with a cold, he said. He didn't want to say any more than the minimum number of words it took to communicate meaning. Talking hurt too much. No wonder, Melissa said. Working nights in that dark, airless factory? Like being in the catacombs. I'm surprised you're not sick all the time. Hey, listen, the kids are over at Mom's and Todd is bowling tonight. I made a pot of chili and some cornbread. I thought I might bring some over and we could have dinner together. Even though he felt horrible, he was still grateful for the offer of company. At least he didn't have to face another evening alone. Sounds nice, he rasped. Okay, I'll be by at 6. Do you need me to pick up anything from the drugstore? A new throat, Stanley thought, but he said, no thanks. With difficulty, he dragged himself out of bed and into the bathroom. He looked in the mirror to survey the damage, which was quite significant. Dark shadows had formed under his bloodshot eyes, and his skin had an unhealthy grayish cast. What worried him most, though, was his right arm. Like his left, it was now so swollen that the sleeve of his uniform was like the casing of a fat sausage. He didn't know if he'd be able to take the shirt off without ripping it. Probably best just to leave it on for now. He splashed on some water onto his face, and managed to control his numb right arm enough to run a comb through his hair, and squeeze some toothpaste onto his toothbrush. Brushing his teeth was so excruciating that tears sprang to his eyes. His throat felt like an open wound, and the inside of his mouth was also raw and inflamed. When he rinsed his mouth and spat out the water, it was streaked with red ribbons of blood. He looked at himself in the mirror again. The grooming he had been able to manage hadn't made much of an improvement. His chin and jaw were shadowed with stubble, but he didn't trust his numb arm enough to use a razor. This would have to do. He staggered to the living room and flopped down on the couch, unable to find enough energy to even pick up the TV remote. Melissa, who had been a responsible person seemingly since birth, arrived at 6 on the dot as promised, carrying a large metal pot and one of the recycled tote bags she used for groceries. Her curly brown hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she was still wearing the button-down shirt and khakis she wore to work. Hey bro, she said, walking in the door. Her greeting was followed by, Yikes, what happened here? Stanley knew things were messy, but he hadn't really given the appearance of the apartment as much thought. Seeing it through Melissa's eyes, though, he knew it was a disaster area. He was embarrassed, but didn't want to show it. He sat back on the couch and tried for a nonchalant shrug. Amber broke up with me, he croaked. Yeah, I know that, she said, looking around with the same repulsed expression she'd had when she was a little girl, and he'd put worms in her hair. But what happened to this place? Amber wasn't the one who cleaned it, was she? No, I did. I just started caring less when she stopped coming over. Without Amber, cleaning didn't seem worth the effort. Few things did. Melissa's look shifted from disgust to sympathy. Poor little bro. Hang on, let me put this chili on the stove to heat it up. She disappeared into the kitchen, and then re-emerged holding a handful of trash bags. It's kind of bad in there, too. Are all your dishes dirty? Pretty much, Stanley said. Melissa took a deep breath. Okay, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to gather up all these cans and bottles and load them in my car to take to the recycling center. I'm going to hold my nose and gather up all the trash and throw it away. And then I'm going to load your dishwasher and run it and hand wash any other dirty dishes that are left over. She looked down at the random pieces of clothing that had been tossed on the floor. I draw the line at touching your dirty socks and underwear. Those are your problem. Fair enough, Stanley croaked. Thank you. I wish I could help. His arms were so weak and heavy he couldn't imagine picking up anything. No, you rest. You look like death holding a cracker, as Granny used to say. She dropped an old fried chicken box into the trash bag. Stanley let himself smile. Yeah, I never understood that expression. Why would death be holding a cracker? I never got it either, Melissa said. Why would the Grim Reaper need it to snack? Isn't he just basically a skeleton? She looked around the room like a general figuring out a plan of attack. Listen, I'm going to make you a cup of tea with honey and lemon like Mom used to make, and then I'll really get going on this cleaning. I don't have any lemons, Stanley rasped. I brought the tea, the lemons, and the honey, Melissa said. Of course she did. You think of everything, Stanley said. Melissa smiled. I try my best. When they were little, Melissa had always organized what games they would play and how they would play them. At the time, he thought the tendency was bossy and annoying, but now he saw it had its good points, especially now that his life had descended into chaos. In a few minutes, Stanley was sitting with a mug of tea in his hands when Melissa launched a one-woman offensive against all the garbage in the living room. "You're amazing," he said. "If you couldn't help her, at least you could praise her." "Well, it's nice to have an appreciative audience." "My kids sure aren't," Melissa said, wrinkling her nose as she picked up an old Chinese food container between her forefinger and thumb and dumped it into a trash bag. "Yeesh, I wonder what that used to be." "Low mine, I think," Stanley said. He winced as he took a swallow of tea. "I'm sorry I let things get so bad. It's not your job to clean up after me." "No, it's not," Melissa said, tossing some wadded-up taco wrappers into the trash bag. "But it is my job to make sure you're okay, and I haven't been doing my job." "That's not true. You've called me—" "Yes, I've called you several times since the breakup to make sure you're okay, and you've always said yes. And you showed up at Max's birthday party, which I thought was a good sign. But clearly I should have come over earlier and checked things out here." She nodded the top of the already full garbage bag. "Because you, little brother of mine, are definitely not okay." "No, I'm not," he half-whispered. He felt like he might cry, which would be embarrassing, crying in front of his big sister like he was a baby again. Stanley wasn't usually a crier. He hadn't cried since their dad had died. But looking at his messy life through her eyes, he could see how bad it was. Her life was so well-balanced. She had a college degree, a job she liked at the courthouse, a nice husband, and 2 kids she was utterly devoted to. Compared to her life, he was pathetic and empty, and his throat hurt so much that the pain all alone almost brought tears to his eyes. Melissa must have sensed his distress, because she patted him on the shoulder and said, "I'll tell you what, let me take a break from cleaning and get us some dinner. The chili should be hot by now, and you might feel a little better once you've had something to eat." Stanley sniffed and nodded. The chili was a family recipe, and it was usually one of Stanley's favorite meals. He was generally good for at least 2 bowls full, sometimes even 3. But tonight, even though the chili was perfect and had shredded cheddar cheese on top and cornbread on the side, the way he liked it, he couldn't eat much. The pepper broth burned going down, making it feel like someone was holding a lit match to his already inflamed throat. "This is not the Stan I know," Melissa said, when he pushed aside his mostly full bowl. "Do you remember what Mom used to call you at mealtimes?" Stan smiled a little. "Her big hungry boy." "She used to say you must have a hollow leg because she couldn't see where you put it all." Melissa cleared their bowls and started loading the dishwasher with 2 weeks' worth of dirty cups, plates, and silverware. "Listen, I know you're going to argue with me about this, but why don't you let me make an appointment for you with the Dr. Todd and the kids I see? She's really nice and easy to talk to." "No doctor," Stanley croaked. An unwanted image popped into his mind of his dad in the hospital bed, pale and skeletally thin, tethered to plastic tubes that snaked all over his body. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I knew you would say that. Look, I know you never liked going to the doctor, and you stopped going once you got too old for Mom to take you. Then you got even weirder about doctors after Dad got sick." "It's not weird," Stanley said. "The doctors made him sicker, then he died. Chemotherapy, radiation, they pumped him full of poison." Melissa shook her head. This was an old argument between them. Stan, Dad knew what was wrong, and he waited too long to get medical attention. Months and months. By the time he saw a doctor, it was too late to help him. They gave the chemo a try, but the cancer had already spread. It probably would have worked if they'd gotten to it earlier. She looked him in the eye. "And now you're being too stubborn to go to the doctor, too. It's like some kind of weird family tradition. Well, it's not one that we should keep up." "I don't have cancer," Stanley rasped. At least he had that going for him. "I'll be okay." "I know you don't have cancer," Melissa said, "but you have a weird combination of symptoms. Your throat's sore, and your arms look all stiff and swollen. Maybe it's just kind of a random virus, but I think you ought to get it checked out." "It'll clear up," Stanley said. He knew it was a weird combination of symptoms too, but he wasn't going to admit it to her. Melissa sighed. "I'll tell you what. I'm going to come over and check on you in 3 days, and if you're not better by then, I'm taking you to the doctor, even if I have to get Todd and his big burly friends from the bowling league to help me drag you there." "Okay," Stanley said, because he knew from experience that ultimately there was no arguing with his big sister. 3 days. Within an hour, Melissa had picked up all the empty bottles and cans and washed all his dirty dishes. Except for the dirty laundry on the floor, the living room was now clutter-free. "Well, that's some improvement anyway," she said, looking around at the newly cleaned surfaces. "I can't thank you enough," Stanley rasped. He was amazed at all the work she had gotten done while he sat on the couch doing exactly nothing. "I don't want you to thank me," Melissa said, putting on her jacket. "What I want you to do is call in sick to work tonight and get some rest." "I'll think about it," he said, knowing he couldn't afford to pass up the money. "Don't think about it, do it." Melissa leaned over the couch and gave him a quick hug. "And remember, if you're not better in 3 days, I'm taking you to the doctor." "I remember." He knew she wasn't going to let him forget. "Okay, I'll get out of your hair now." She patted the top of his head. "What you have left of it." Stanley laughed. He had definitely inherited his father's receding hairline. "You were always the mean one." Stanley had no intention of calling in sick to work. Since he already had his uniform on, he didn't need to do much to get ready after Melissa left. True, the walk to work was more tiring than usual. His throat burned and stung, and his numb, swollen arms were so heavy he was practically dragging them like a ball in a chain. Still, he made it. And now here he was again, descending the hidden stairs and passing the stinking bio-waste bin to arrive at his dark, subterranean workplace. Stanley made his way down the dim hallway. The greenish light gave his already pale skin an even sicklier cast. He scanned his ID badge and settled at his desk in the security office to check the monitors. As always, there was nothing unusual. It was the least demanding job ever. He knew his sister wanted him to stay at home and get rest. But why not come to work where he could nap and get paid for it? He leaned back in his chair and was snoring lightly. When the pain in his throat woke him a couple hours later, the ballerina doll was on his desk again. It was weird the way the thing kept showing up like that, only to disappear again. He really ought to ask someone about it, but he never saw anyone to ask. Out of habit, he picked up the doll and tilted it. "We like you," it said. He studied the doll's empty eyes and black, gaping grin. Really, who thought it was a good idea making a doll that looked like this? Yeah, so you keep saying," he said. Where had the doll come from? Who had manufactured it? Had it been made here in the factory? He turned it over to see if he could find a stamp of some kind on it. "Take me home with you," the doll said. "So you keep saying that too, but whenever I'm ready to go home, you're always gone. You're sending me mixed messages, little dolly," Stanley said. He really ought to conserve his voice. It was barely above a whisper. He tilted the doll again. "Take me home with you." Stanley set the doll down on the desk and reached for another throat lozenge. "I tell you what. I can't take you home if you keep disappearing, but if you stay put and are still on the desk when I wake up, you can come home with me." That's great, Stanley, he thought. Try to reason with an inanimate object. He was in some sorry shape. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Stanley was at work, but for some reason the greenish lights that usually provided the building's only illumination had been turned off. He remembered a school field trip to a cave. The tour guide had explained that the fish in the cave's underground pond had no eyes, because even if they did have them, it would be too dark for them to see anything. The building was dark like that. His flashlight was the only thing that made it possible for him to make his way down the hall. He shined it on the walls, on the metal doors, on the floor ahead of him, creating small circles of light in the darkness. Was the whole building without electricity, he wondered? It must not be, because he could still hear the rumbling and clanging of the machinery behind the locked metal doors. He had a strong feeling that something was not right. He needed to get to the office to see if the security monitors were working, or if they were down due to the power outage. If they were, he guessed he would have to walk around in the dark and check that each exit was secure. He shined his flashlight ahead. It lit up the sign reading "Security Office" on his door. The scanner for his security badge wasn't working, so he used the key he kept in case of emergency. The security office was as dark as the rest of the building. All the monitors were down. He shined the flashlight around the room, letting its beam rest on familiar objects. The desk, the chair, the filing cabinet. He moved the flashlight's beam toward the left corner of the room. The beam illuminated a face. The face did not belong to a human. It was the face of a cartoon animal. A bear, maybe? Wearing a bow tie and a top hat. As Stanley shined its light on it, the two sides of its face swung open like double doors to reveal a hideous metallic skull made of snaking wires and cables. It stared at Stanley with blank, bulging eyes and sprang at him, its jaws snapping. Stanley woke with a start. He had never had nightmares like he'd experienced these last few nights while napping at work. What were these strange mechanical creatures that were haunting his dreams? Were these terrors caused by the sadness of losing Amber, or were they symptoms of his physical illness? Or maybe the two things were connected. One thing was for sure. He had never been so physically and emotionally unwell at the same time. He looked down at his desk. It was bare. The doll hadn't followed his orders to stay put. Stanley stood up and stretched. He shook his head as if doing so might unscramble his confused brain. Of course the doll hadn't followed his orders to stay put, he thought, because it was a doll. It couldn't understand what he was saying. No matter how many times it said otherwise, the doll didn't really want to go home with him. It didn't want anything because it wasn't alive, and the words it seemed to say were just set, pre-recorded noises. None of this explained, though, how the doll just showed up on his desk and then disappeared. It couldn't move on its own, so who was putting it there and taking it away? Was somebody playing some kind of prank? But who would play a prank on Stanley? To his knowledge, nobody else who worked here had ever even seen him. After his shift, Stanley skipped the city diner. He would have kind of liked to see Katie, but his throat hurt too much to eat anything, and the thought of food nauseated him. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in a store window. Gray, sweaty, stubbly face and swollen, limp arms. No doubt about it. If he were holding only a cracker, he would look exactly like death. He thought of Katie recommending the nurse at the walk-in clinic. Maybe he should stop there. Nurses weren't the same as doctors. He remembered the school nurse when he was a kid as being very kind. He had to do something. He couldn't go on feeling this bad. And sadly, that's where we're going to have to end it for now. That was part 2 of Room for One More. I'm really excited to read part 3 because now apparently the Funtime animatronics are showing up. There was Funtime Foxy there, and now I'm assuming Funtime Freddy. I don't know. It's really weird. I'm excited to see where this goes, and I'm really confused. Alright, I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.